Hi, I'm Mandy Medley. I'm one of the worker owners here at Pilsen Community Books, and I'm honored to welcome you here tonight for an event with Tessa Bridal and our friend Daniel Borzutzky to mark the publication of The Dark Side of Memory, Uruguay's Disappeared Children and the Families That Never Stop Searching. This important book highlights the largely unknown history of the state-sponsored kidnapping of children in Uruguay and Argentina during the Cold War, and it tells the stories of mothers and grandmothers who continued the decades-long searches for the children. It also tells the stories of the children themselves, now adults, who were born in secret torture centers where their mothers were murdered by those who kept them as their own. And in fact, the title of the book comes from one of the grandmothers of the disappeared, and it was used to describe her granddaughter's reluctance to accept that she is a child of the disappeared and not of the family that raised her, the dark side of memory. The poet Tony Altman had the following to say about the book. Tessa Bridal's The Dark Side of Memory has the immediacy of a novel. We travel alongside a group of indefatigable women into the torture centers of the Argentine military junta through their long bureaucratic battles to rescue the children who were stolen from them. This is a book about the way the violence of the past weighs on the future, shaping its possibilities. And it is also a book about how acknowledging that past, fighting against the seductions of forgetting, opens a less violent, more human future. And I think now, when the Biden administration is still struggling to care for migrant children apprehended at our country's border, and children who are evacuated from Afghanistan are still suffering trauma at Chicago's shelters run by the Heartland Alliance here in the city, which is also a close collaborator with ICE, the story of the children caught up in political violence and the dark side of memory is more relevant than ever. And I want to thank you, Tessa and Daniel, both for joining us here tonight for this important event. A few notes about how this evening will go. First, I'll introduce Daniel and Tessa, who will then both read a bit, and then they will discuss the book. And at the end, we'll have time for a short Q&A, so feel free at any time during the event to drop questions in the chat, and I'll make sure they're read at the appropriate time. Also, if the stream drops out, just hang tight, go back to our YouTube channel, and we'll resume as soon as possible. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that you could purchase both The Dark Side of Memory and Daniel's books, including his most recent one, on our website at pilsencommunitybooks.com or in the store. And now, without further ado, I'll introduce Daniel Borzutzky. Daniel Borzutzky is the author of several poetry collections, including The Book of Interfering Bodies, In the Murmurs of the Rotten Carcass Economy, The Performance of Becoming Human, which was winner of the 2016 National Book Award, Lake Michigan, which was a finalist for the 2019 Griffin International Poetry Prize, and most recently, Written After a Massacre in the Year 2018. He has also translated books by Chilean poets Raul Surita and Jaime Luis Huenen. He teaches at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I'll turn it over to you, Daniel.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Mandy. Thanks to Pilsen Books. Everyone in Chicago, please support Pilsen Books. And I guess on the internets too. Pilsen Books is a wonderful, wonderful place, and we're lucky to have them. And thank you so much, Tessa, for inviting me to join you. It's such a pleasure to be a part of this event. So as Mandy said, I'll read for about 15 minutes or so, and then turn it over to Tessa, who will present from her new book. I'm going to begin. Mandy mentioned that I have translated the work of Raul Surita, and I'm going to begin with a few newish translations that I've done of Raul's. For those who are not familiar with Surita, he is a Chilean poet born in 1950, really wonderful writer, one of the best known and really best Latin American and Spanish language poets in the world. Was arrested in 1973 when he was a university student during the military coup, and in many ways has spent his writing career over the last 45, however many years, 40, 50 years, writing about the experience of living in a destroyed country, or a country destroyed by dictatorship. So these pieces are from a section of a larger book called Zurita. The section is called Canto de los Hijos Solos, Song of the Solitary Children. And they are actually kind of found text. They are found text. They are transcripts from interviews with family members of victims of the dictatorship. And they were conducted in conjunction with, I think, the Museum of Memory in Chile and the Association of the Family Members of the Disappeared. So I'll just read a few of those, and then I'll read some of my own newer work. Song of the Solitary Children. And crying, she would say, "No one loves me, and my children have forgotten me." But can someone abandon their youngest kids on the street? Or can a mother forget the child she is nursing? Fine. But even if you show me the masses who do indeed forget them, I will never forget you. I am Maria Jose Martinez, his daughter. Abel, my father, was born in Viña del Mar in 1947. Son of Georgina and Abel, he grew up in Viña with his mother and his brother Bruno. Having grown up in poverty, he made ends meet by working odd jobs. He is remembered for always wanting to be helpful, for brightening life. He loved to dance and he was funny. He is remembered especially for being protective and responsible, and he had political and social interests. At a very young age, he met Maria Isabel and they quickly had a family. They were two kids taking care of one another. He had 5 children, Claudio, Abel, Cristian, Luciano, and me. They participated in the Salvador Allende occupation in Viña. Later, they managed to buy a lot on Mariposas Hill in Valparaíso, where we lived our first few years. He was skinny, tall, and had curly hair. The only photo I have of him is from when he sold ice cream on the beach. My brothers and I remember that he would make candied apples sealed in plastic to sell on the streets. My memories of him are from our house on Mariposas Hill, the utopias that followed, the communal dreams, or his affection when he would come home and we would get together to eat the food he brought us. He was an activist with the MIR. His comrades remembered him as being politically committed. In the early years of the dictatorship, he was arrested in the resistance in Viña del Mar. While imprisoned, he asked his comrades to take care of us. Those who survived looked out for his kids. He was Abel Alfredo Vilches Figueroa, arrested and disappeared on January 27, 1975. I am his daughter, Maria Jose Martinez, and I remember him. I am Manuel Guerrero Antequerra, his son. Manuel, my father, was born in Santiago in June 1948. Son of an autodidactic writer and a garment worker, he had 8 siblings. He grew up amid the voyages my grandfather made, collecting stories for his characters. His childhood was marked by poverty. When he was 14, he joined the communist youth and he was the student leader for the National Federation of Normal School Students. He met my mother, Veronica Antequerra, in the March for Vietnam. They had 2 kids, America and me. On the day they got married, there was a transit workers' strike, and Baldi, as they called my father, managed to make it to the ceremony in a garbage truck. He liked to read and study. He loved Soviet literature and Cesar Vallejo. Music energized him. He loved dancing to rock and roll, and they say he was one of the first to bring salsa to Chile. My most cherished memories of him are from when we would wash dishes together. In 1984, we went to Cartagena and listened to Bob Marley on his boombox. My father was a man who loved life. After the coup, my father stayed in Chile and reorganized the communist youth. He was arrested and tortured several times. Together, we went into exile, and while in Hungary, after separating from my mother, he fell in love with Owana, with whom he had a daughter, Manuela Libertad. He never got to know her because in March 1985, after returning to Chile and participating in the teachers' union, he was kidnapped by the police at the Colegio Latino Americano. He was Manuel Guerrero Ceballos, a political prisoner executed on March 30th, 1985. I am Manuel Guerrero Antequerra, and I remember him. I am Rosa Molina Huaracan, his daughter. Freddie was born in Concepcion in the southern winter of 1939. He grew up with his mother, whom he adored, and his brother and sister, Jose and Rosa. He grew up in the northern neighborhood of that city, helping his mother sell coal in the Vega Monumental market on the paths to the Chato and Penco beaches, joking around with his friends, hanging off trains, and playing soccer. In Concepcion, he worked as a fisherman, cobbler, and he learned how to weave pretty purses with plastic threads. He met Inez, whom he married in 1962, and Freddie and I, his children, were born. In search of a better life, in 1966, we emigrated to Santiago, where Maria Luz, his spoiled princess, was born. We lived in El Cortijo, and he worked as a laborer, building houses outside of Santiago. When he would get home, he was affectionate. He made his favorite meals for us, bean or bread soup. He loved watching cowboy movies and Cantinflas in the Chile Teatro. I remember him as handsome, tall, and thin with green eyes. He was a conversationalist and a sharp dresser. I remember he would grab a blanket and take his 3 kids to the grove in Cortijo. We would hang out in the shade with the neighbors, or his happiness when we traveled by train to Concepcion on vacations to see his mother. In September 1973, they leveled our housing project. He wasn't a political militant, but he didn't have his identity card and they arrested him. He was Freddy Molina Rodriguez, executed on September 26, 1973. I am his daughter, Rosa Molina Huaracan, and I remember him. So I'll switch to my own writing, but again, those were 3 pieces by Raul Surita, and as I said, they are testimonies that he has formed into poems, but they're testimonies of survivors of family members of those who were killed by the military dictatorship in Chile. And I'm going to read from a book that I'm working on called The Murmuring Grief of the Americas. Many of these pieces I have not read, so I'll read just a few of them, and then we'll turn it over to Tessa. So, Murmuring Grief of the Americas, scenes 1 to 8. 1. The hole they dig in the street is deep enough to fill with the bodies the police murder. They do not need to cram the Midwestern bodies into the hole. The bodies fit comfortably into the earth. They do not need to squeeze the buried bodies into the hole. They do not need to burn the buried bodies. They treat the bodies better in death than they do in life. There is no decomposition. There is only composition. The dead bodies accumulate as if they are the currency that has long been promised by the agents of power and money. 2. We ask them what they want to do with themselves now that they don't get to live anymore. They say they want to eat all the things they could not eat when they were alive. They say they want to love all the things they could not love when they were alive. They ask us to carve their names into the hills, and they give us more love than we have ever known. They hold us and say, you do not have to survive. You do not have to keep moaning. You do not have to keep living. What they mean is, in death, we will finally learn about the promise and dignity of life. We do not recognize the meaning of these words, and we cannot understand why we hear them at this particular time. The only thing we want to know is, how can we not become the history of the dead road, the history of the dead water, the history of the dead dirt, the history of our children whose bodies will never grow? 3. The desert is exploding and there are bodies guarding the border, trying to catch our friends so they can torture them. The men who stand guard have proudly named themselves after early American revolutionaries. When they find nuns leaving jugs of water for the migrants, they run one of them over with a car. They believe in the same God as the nuns, and they believe that the nuns are agents of Satan. They detain the nuns and turn them over to the police, who keep them in solitary confinement. In dreams, we capture the ugly bodies of the racist vigilantes, drive them across the border, and leave them in a deserted valley. We awake to a state covered in disease. The infected bodies rub one against the other as they sing songs of love to their whiteness. They think they can defeat nature because stupid men have told them they can defeat nature. They think they can defeat nature because God has told them they can defeat nature. They gather by a bonfire and feed the flames with masks and medicine. Let the earth devour their bodies. 4. They ask us what we are doing at Target, and we tell them we need to buy sheets. We cannot pronounce our words correctly, and they say, you need to buy shits, you need to buy shits, and they arrest us and laugh at us and tell the manager of the store that we look like shit and smell like shit, and ha, isn't it funny that we need to buy shit? And in our dreams, we throw up on them. Our vomit is purple like the dirty milk they jam into our bodies. They have snakes in their hair, and they say, we are fighting to protect the revolution of the endangered white man. They suck us in and suck us out and show us pictures of their motorboats destroyed in last year's hurricane. Just debris now, they say. And they tell us the rain is our fault. They say we are like the evil wind that blows through the Carolinas. They say, you are lucky to have your lives. They say, we hate you because you are what we are not. May your body fill with disease. 6. We meet them on the beach at the edge of the city. To the north are the suburbs, and to the south we see high-rises that carve death and money into the sky. The teachers have disappeared into the rotten carcass economy. The police wage war against the poor and torture in secret and not-so-secret facilities. When the city finally erupts in riots, all the newscasters can say is, such a shame, so much property has been damaged. The newscasters care more about the Apple Store than they do about dignity or murder or poverty or life or death. The good old boys with combat boots and guns show up to take back the streets and, quote, restore the city to law and order. The city protects their rights to wave their automatic weapons in the air like they just don't care. Around the corner, an innocent woman was gunned down by the cops. We leave flowers to mark her murder and to remember her life. Each day the cops take them away, and each day we put them back. Beloved is the body who cannot speak. Beloved is the death we witness. 7. First come the winds. They are so light we can barely feel them. The moist air hangs above the hills, and when the rain falls, there is no thunder to move it. There is only a huge storm and a light wind, and the cloud mass forms a smaller cloud mass, and soon there are cloud masses waiting to take their revenge. The murderers want to change the weather, but their science is all wrong. The air pressure is too low, and the rain falls, and so do the rocks, so do the trees, so do the hills and houses. When the town is obliterated by the flood, the murderers pay $150 million to rebuild it, but they cannot bring back the bodies who lay dead in the debris. Blessed are the hills that survive. Blessed are the hills that die. I'll read more pieces. This is called Lake Michigan, Scene 520. Beloved is the body who remembers its organs are not equal to its neighbor's organs. Beloved is the body who remembers its prayers are not equal to its neighbor's prayers, who knows that even in death you must conceal your labor so that those who survive cannot see how their bodies have been fabricated out of your body. Beloved is the poor body, the rich body, the obliteration of my body, the obliteration of a body more important than mine. Beloved is the wind that blows the ashes from east to west, the bodies they set on fire with the proper precautions, the expensive houses at the edge of the beach. Beloved is the body they refuse to save. Beloved is the dying water, the fertilizer, the geranium, the zinnia, the marigold, the blooming gardens that fulfill the aesthetic requirements of those who own the city. Beloved is the gag in the mouth, the mud in the mouth, the street they hang over the city, the body they pin to the outside of my body, the lake filled with diseased bodies. Beloved is the rich body who has the right to stay alive, the poor body who has the right to die, the regulation, the regulator, the ratio of risk to reward, the entrepreneurial body who sings, how much for his body fat, how much for his healthy hands, how much for his scabby fingers. Before I die, they warn me, you must weep, but only in private. You must love, but only in private. You must die more privately. But I did not believe them, and they told me I would die from so much grief shame. They sing, it is shameful to eat, shameful to sleep, shameful to pray, shameful to love. Beloved are you who dies because it is your fault. who dies shamefully from the disease because you fail to protect your tongue from your arm, your right cheek from your left hand, your lips from your teeth. I am dying again, and I hear them saying to another body, you can stay alive as long as you remember you don't have the right to be anything more than what we need you to be. Beloved is the starving body on the beach, the particle that drops to the soil, the river that carries the rock to the mountain that turns into a melting glacier. Beloved is the city stuck between time and death. Beloved is the shrieking, the hunger, the malleable worker, the malleable flesh, the breath that refuses to stop. And I will read one more piece and then turn it over to Tessa. This is finally Lake Michigan Sea number 1201, non-essential personnel. They take our non-essential bodies to the lake and tell us to record the history of the waves, the history of the sand, the history of the wind, the history of the horizon, the history of the snails and crabs, the lake of disappearing bodies. They say, you must document the lake because we don't know if it will be here tomorrow. And if it's not here tomorrow, then who is to say that it had ever been here at all? They say, you are non-essential bodies. Without you, the city will not disintegrate. But what they do not tell us is that soon, by necessity, we will become essential bodies, responsible for containment, isolation, reinvention, simulation. We will become essential bodies who witness the precise moment the city transitions from Category 1 disaster to Category 2 disaster to Category 3 disaster. We crawl with our heads pegged to the earth, and when we find bone shards or hair or torn clothing or bloody bandages, we seal and store them as if they are essential documents of Western civilization. When they ask us how the city will burn, we say, it will burn with God. When they ask us about love, we say, love is when we burn to save the lives of other bodies more essential than our own. And we wonder, will it be essential or non-essential personnel who store us, who quantify us, who protect us, who pay us, and love us? Will we be disassembled by essential or non-essential bodies? We crawl to the lake, and already we see its disappearance. We look out into the distance, and we understand that after they burn the bodies, the sand in the lake will disappear forever. And someone asks, where will your non-essential bodies go when the sand is gone? Where will the water go when the lake is gone? Who will probe your voice, your skin, your hair to see if it is essential or non-essential? Are the organs drying up in your body essential or non-essential? The essential blood documents of Western civilization are burning. The architecture in the intestines of the empire is burning. The non-essential personnel are murmuring with grief shame. The sand is shrieking its last shriek in the non-essential archives of time. Thank you so much, and I will turn it over now to Tessa.
Thanks, Daniel. I'd like to now introduce Tessa. Tessa, I'm doing your long introduction because I liked it very much. I hope you don't mind.
Not at all.
Tessa Bridal was born and raised in Uruguay, a third-generation descendant of a resilient and courageous Irish woman who boarded a ship she had been informed was sailing for Boston. Once on the high seas, she discovered that she was instead headed for Buenos Aires. Her ancestor's story is told in Bridal's second novel, River of Painted Birds. Generations later, Bridal reached the shores her great-great-grandmother thought she was bound for. She worked in Washington, D.C., saving to take a 3-year acting and directing course at a London drama academy. She returned to the United States and settled in Minnesota, where she studied sign language and became artistic director of the Minnesota Theater Institute of the Deaf. Her first novel, The Tree of Red Stars, won the Milkweed National Prize for Fiction and the Friends of American Writers Annual Award. Her work has been reviewed by the New York Times and praised by educators and historians. She is the recipient of the American Association of Museums Educators Award for Excellence, and her work in creating educational theater programs that became the model not only for science and children's museums, but for zoos and aquariums as well. She has worked at the Science Museum of Minnesota, the Indianapolis Children's Museum, and the Monterey Bay Aquarium. She is the proud mother of 2 daughters and grandmother of 2 boys, 7 and 5, with a promising future in wrestling, magical thinking, and experimental science. And I'll turn it over to you, Tessa.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, I want to add my thanks to Daniel, to you, Mandy, and to Pilsen Community Books for hosting us this evening. And I wish Toby was here because a very dear friend of ours introduced us, and I want to thank her as well. Her name is Eloise Klein, and she introduced me to Toby and Toby to me, and that's the reason we're here today. So thank you, Eloise. I want to talk a little bit before I read about the setting and the time of The Dark Side of Memory. The setting is primarily Argentina, and its very, very small neighbor, Uruguay, which is my country of origin. And the time is the 1970s, the peak of the Cold War. And it was a time when democracies in Latin America were falling left, right, and center. And at one point, Argentina was the last holdout. And by then, thousands and thousands of people had sought refuge there, and then found themselves in a dictatorship again, and were taken to secret torture centers that Daniel mentioned as well in his poetry reading. And they were called chupaderos, from the verb chupar, to suck in. And it was very, very rare for anyone to survive a chupadero. Their children were very highly prized, especially babies. And the authorities either dropped them off in orphanages, but without any information, like no names, no indication of where they had been taken from, which made it then tremendously difficult for family members to locate them. But they were also adopted by members of both the police forces and the military, sometimes even by families, members that had been responsible for the disappearance of their children, of those children. So I am going to read an excerpt today from which includes a woman called Sara, who is very prominent in the book, and who, after the episode that I will read from, is taken to one of the secret torture centers herself. And she is trying to help 2 women whose adult children have disappeared already, and they are aware of this when they arrive in Argentina to search for their grandchildren, who they have no idea what was done with them. Esther tried to quell the feeling of nausea she felt as she buttoned her long wool coat and prepared to meet Violeta at the ferry. How had it come to this? How was it possible that 2 respectable families, wanting only that their children graduate with honors and find good marriage partners, were now faced with the reality of those children arrested and their grandchildren disappeared? The wind blew cold off the river as the 2 women disembarked in Buenos Aires a few hours later and left the dock to find a taxi. They gave the driver Emilia and Jorge's address and rode in silence. One never knew who was an informer these days and how words could be used against one. They paid the driver at the curb and approached the little house with a window on the street. No effort had been made to repair the broken down front door. Its shattered remains listed precariously, shards of wood pointing like spears toward the sky. They moved some pieces aside and stepped into the small living room. Nothing of any value or use was left in the house. Every scrap of clothing had been taken, every book, every plate, every pot. A broken chair lay on the floor, along with some newspapers and a fork with twisted tines. The kitchen was bare of appliances, the only item a piece of colored wool in a corner. Esther picked it up. It was a little cap with 3 pom-poms on the top. Esther put it in her pocket, and she and Violeta continued the search. They opened every cabinet, searched every closet, but there was nothing there. A similar scenario awaited them nearby at Carla and Fernando's. Only there, thanks to the neighbors who had run into the apartment as soon as the Secret Service gang had left, collecting everything they could find, there were 2 invaluable items: the little boys' birth certificates. Unlike Emilia and Jorge's neighbors who had not answered their doorbells, these neighbors were willing to tell Violeta that her daughter Carla and husband Fernando had been taken during the night and the children left in a neighbor's care. A woman stepped forward, clearly wishing she did not have to. I kept them for 2 days. The baby cried all the time. I couldn't calm him. My husband said he was going crazy and our own children were being neglected. I'm sorry, Senora, but I gave them to the police. What do you mean you don't know? Esther shouted at the policeman, brandishing Mariana's hat in his face. What kind of police force is this? Violeta added. Everything in our daughters' houses has been stolen or destroyed. Where are they? Where are their husbands? Where are our grandchildren? The policeman held up his hands. Perhaps they moved, senoras. Are you a complete idiot? Esther said. Why would they break everything they owned before moving? Some people, you're playing us for fools, Violeta said. Murder has been done. Children have disappeared. Senoras, these are difficult times. We know that the children were handed over to you. Even if they were, we wouldn't have kept them, senoras. Try social services. Social services did not know or would not reveal what had been done with them. We're mad, Violeta, Esther said as they sat warming their hands over cups of coffee. We must be mad. How can such things happen? The only thing we can do is search the orphanages, their friend Sara told them. I have a list and I've borrowed a car. They began in Buenos Aires. Violeta and Esther, accompanied by a nurse, walked along rows of cribs and playpens full of babies and toddlers. Some were crying. Some lay in their cribs staring at the ceiling. Some looked like miniatures of the shell-shocked soldiers they had seen on newsreels after the Second World War. These were all brought in during the last few days, the nurse said. Violeta and Esther smiled at the children, holding tightly to one another, afraid that if they let go, they would break into 1,000 pieces. At the second orphanage, they again reviewed a row of cribs and looked into a room full of 1 to 3-year-olds. A few held their arms out to them, and it was all the women could do to keep walking, to keep looking. 2 babies had died, the nurse said. Did they want to see the bodies? They had not prepared themselves for such an eventuality, but not confirming whether the bodies belonged to their grandchildren was not an option. They looked at one another, and Esther nodded. Once outside, after viewing the bodies, they gave vent to every emotion that had racked them during their visit. They supported each other and sobbed until it seemed as if there were no more tears left in them. Then they blew their noses and told Sara they were ready to continue. They left Buenos Aires and began in La Plata. Accompanied by a young doctor in a white lab coat, Violeta and Esther once more began the rounds, cradle by cradle, little face by little face. This was their last stop. If Mariana, Daniel, and Gabriel were not here, there were no more orphanages to search. Suddenly, Violeta stopped in front of a crib containing a 3 to 4-month-old baby. There was an IV connected to the top of his head. Boy or girl? Violeta asked. A boy. He's lost his suction reflex, the doctor said, caressing the baby's cheek. Let me see his left hand. The doctor uncovered the baby's hand, revealing a small, dark birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on the inside of his wrist. I need to sit down. The doctor hurried to bring a chair, and Esther eased Violeta into it. It's him. I had to be sure. He was as fat as butter when he was born. And will be again, Esther said. Where is his brother? With the other 2-year-olds. Please bring him. The doctor nodded. Before she left, she asked Violeta if she wanted to hold the baby. May I? It's what these children need most. She disconnected the IV, put Daniel in Violeta's arms, and hurried away. Daniel barely stirred. He's dying, Violeta cried. We'll make him well, you'll see. It's as the doctor said, he needs to be held. They looked up as the doctor returned, carrying Gabriel. He did not look emaciated as his brother did, but his eyes were distant, vacant. And when his grandmother handed Daniel to Esther and took Gabriel in her arms, he did not respond. What do we have to do to claim them? Esther asked the doctor. Take them. What? Just like that? Senora, the weary young doctor said, follow my advice. If any questions are asked, I'll make something up. Everyone here is aware of what's going on with these children. I'm going to leave you now to get a drink of water for your friend who nearly fainted. When I come back, perhaps the 4 of you will have found that side door over there, and you'll be gone. Sara was overjoyed and incredulous to see them emerging from the side of the building, each carrying a child. Her joy did not last long. Daniel is dying, Violeta said. I have to get him to a doctor. Not here, Esther said, in Montevideo. How? Sara asked. We'll think of a way. Hurry, drive us to the ferry. By the time they reached the dock, they had worked out a plan. Sara parked the car, and Esther and Violeta went in to buy their tickets while she stayed with the children. As she held Daniel, Sara experienced a moment of sheer panic. What if her child was taken, just as Carla's and Amy's had been? She should have forgotten all about her desire to be a mother and never expose a child to the fate that had befallen these. No baby should have to suffer this way, she thought, looking at Daniel's gray skin, his tiny puckered hands, and the bones that showed starkly on his skull. And his brother, his serious, still brother, who was staring straight ahead and had not made a sound since he had been put in the car. As had been arranged, Sara took the children and went into the terminal, making her way to the bathroom. There was a woman there washing her hands, and Sara saw that 2 of the stalls were occupied. She waited until the woman had left and looked cautiously under the doors. Violeta and Esther were there. What followed would have been comical if the situation was not so dire. She handed Gabriel to Esther and took baby Daniel into the stall where Violeta was waiting. Violeta was a substantial woman of generous proportions, and the stall was narrow, making it difficult for her to maneuver around Sara to take off her jacket and hang it over the door. Using Sara's scarf, they tied Daniel to Violeta's chest, positioning him so he could breathe. Violeta then put her jacket back on and buttoned it over him. Having concealed the baby, they left the stall and placed the silent Gabriel in front of Esther, covering him with her long, full coat. Before leaving the bathroom, Esther reached into her bag and took out Mariana's tiny hat. You won't stop looking? She asked, pressing it into Sara's hands. Never. When the 3 women emerged, Gabriel was walking just as he had been told, under Esther's coat and between her legs. Sara did not think they would get away with it. Long as the coat was, anyone looking closely could see his feet. Supporting Esther as if she were very frail, Sara and Violeta made their way toward the counter where their tickets and documents would be examined. This, Sarah thought, was surely the moment when one or both of the children would decide to cry.
Wow. Thank you, Tessa. That was really a powerful passage. Thank you for reading that.
Thank you.
I'll turn it over to you and Daniel for a conversation.
Okay.
Sure. Thank you so much, Tessa. It's hard to imagine what it was like writing this book and thinking about this. But maybe just to start, maybe you could talk about how you went about researching these stories.
Well, I knew that I had to do a lot of historical research because I myself was not completely clear on what had happened. How had it happened that all of these democracies fell in Latin America? And as the more I read and studied, the more I understood what a large role the United States had played in undermining those democracies. And so the book became just as much about US history as it did about Latin American history. The other thing I did was I traveled to Uruguay, and thanks to friends and relatives, and Uruguay is a small place and we all know each other. We have a saying that's somos pocos y nos conocemos, which means there are few of us and we know each other. So it was not that difficult to find my way to the families of the detained disappeared who had organized to try and find their missing relatives. And thanks to them, I was put directly in touch with all of the women you just heard about, plus some others. And I recorded everything they told me, and they told me their story. Well, this one among them. But when I returned to the United States, and it was just before 9/11. And as I wrote the book and started writing the history as well as the personal parts, I sent it out to several readers who were influential people in the publishing world. And what I was told was that it was not a book that could ever be published. And so I was the criticisms were very harsh, and it put me off for quite a long time from doing anything with the book. But eventually I decided I would go back to it, and that this time now I had to interview the children who were adults by now. And so that was my last and most recent step. Earlier this year, I interviewed the children themselves, and they told me their stories and the effect that everything, or their disappearance, their adoption, being found, trying to accept that they were not who they thought they were, all of that came to the fore. And I wrote as much of that as I could into the book as well.
And I'll just say to the audience, if you would like to ask questions of Tessa or make any comments, please type them into the chat, and we'll get to them. So I've 3 or 4 questions swirling around in my head, but I'm surprised by the comment. Well, I don't know if I'm surprised, but the publisher's comment of not finding the book to be not publishable. What was that about? Why?
Because of what it revealed about the United States at a time when, just after 9/11, when the United States was under attack and they felt it was unpatriotic.
Wow. And so do you think that it's just simply like I guess we're a couple decades away from that, but do you think it's just time? Or, I mean, you seem to be saying that something you did to the book made it more palatable, but it also seems, the historical change.
Well, I think it was mainly a historical change. At that time, one of the people who was the harshest and most surprised me was someone I knew quite well, who was a Pulitzer Prize winner of writing about the Vietnam War. And he was very categorical about the book being unpublishable at that time because of what the United States was going through after the attack. And that any book that criticized, even openly or just historically criticized, what the United States had done was just not acceptable. So I think it's history that changed. I mean, the time has gone by, and I think we're in a very different place than we were, 20 some years ago. And there was an opening there in a wonderful small press that accepted my book.
When you started to read this section, I was noted the phrase that the women came from respectable families.
Mm-hmm.
And so it occurs to me that there's two things going on. That on the one hand, the women are, of course, in grief and shock and trauma, looking for the children, and on the other hand, they're experiencing revelations about the truths about their own existences and about their country.
Yes. Mm.
And I wonder if you could maybe, I think respectable family means something very different in a kind of Latin American urban context than it does in the United States. But maybe you could talk a little bit about what you're getting at with the family on the one hand, and then sort of to that to add the discussion of kind of what it was like for them to come to grips with these truths about, I guess, themselves on the one hand, but also, their understanding of their own places and the government, right? But I'll stop there.
Yeah. Well, it was again a very different time. That these women had grown up in an Uruguay that was very prosperous, that had a lot of opportunities for people willing to work hard, which in their cases they had and their husbands had. And they had established a very middle class existence that to them felt like a great triumph, and that they had worked very hard to get there. And then all of a sudden, the country became this place of unrest where people of the far left, on the far left and the far right, and they were in conflict with one another, and their children were definitely amongst those on the far left, which their mothers, these two mothers, thought was correct politically, but extremely dangerous, which it ended up being 100 times more dangerous than either of them had ever expected. So in their time, a respectable family was a family that worked hard. Their children studied. Most of them went to university, which they could do because in Uruguay, university is free. So, and that they would then go on into careers and have families, and the families would continue the old traditions of getting together every Sunday for a wonderful lunch of pasta, and then suddenly all of this was shattered. So I don't know if I've answered your question about what it meant to be respectable, but that's the best I think I can do.
And no, I think you did. But it seems to me too then that that they must have been experiencing so many sort of shocks all at the same time, right?
Yes. And one thing that, just occurred to me was that a respectable family never had anything to do with the police and possibly not the military. So, and here they were, and they knew that they were going to have to confront at least the police and maybe even the military. And while it didn't happen at this time, it did happen later that these were very gutsy women, and they found themselves confronting all kinds of people in power who could just as easily have disappeared them.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like we have some questions.
Yes. We have a few questions in the chat. The first one here says, what first triggered your idea to write this book and commit all the research that it took?
I wish I had a good answer to that. I think it was when I began to learn about the disappearance of children. I had been a first grade teacher myself, and at the time when I started doing the research, I had 2 young daughters, and the very idea that children could disappear was just so shocking to me. And so I began the research, and just one thing led to another. And as I mentioned, Uruguay is a small country. So when I went there and started asking questions, everyone had someone they could introduce me to who would give me information. And I was just fascinated by the topic and horrified, but fascinated and wanted to write about it.
Great, thank you. I have another question here, which I'm curious about as well. They said you write movingly in the book about the way the practices of the juntas resonates with contemporary U.S. policy at the border. Would love to hear you expand on those connections and resonances.
I think the connection is not that there are similarities between the way, necessarily the way people are being treated at the border and what was happening in the torture centers. Not that kind of similarity. But the similarity is in the long-term effect of separating children from their parents. No matter what the age of the child, it is profoundly traumatic. And it causes not only personal trauma to the child, it causes family trauma. And that is the parallel that I was drawing, is that recently we have done that. We've taken children away from their parents. We've put them in places that were not exactly hospitable and home-like, which might have made a small difference. And then we have taken a very long time reuniting them, and not all of them have yet been reunited.
Yeah. I wonder, can I jump in for a moment?
Yes, please do.
Yes.
Tessa, of course, there's the similarities that you're talking about the childhood separation, but I wonder too if there's not like a kind of rhetorical similarity as well in the kind of foreign alien invader rhetoric that was happening both. That happens obviously in the U.S. towards immigrants, but was maybe the ways in which the socialist left was discussed by the dictatorships as well, right? That's sort of
yes,
of a kind of disease that is infecting the country seems, at least rhetorically.
Yes, a very, very good point, Daniel. Yes. Yes, that there is a similarity there, that somehow these people are dangerous.
We're almost out of time, which I'm so sad to say, but we do have one last question here, which I also was curious. I feel like you stopped your passage at just the right point, Tessa. But someone here wants to know, and they promised they'll buy the book. They said, did the women get the children away? Were they successfully rescued?
Do you think I should answer?
That's up to you. You can say buy the book or not, but I just want to say it was asked.
Yes, I wonder if there are some people who would prefer not to know and to read the rest of their adventure because it didn't end there. That's what I'll say.
I think that's a great point. Well, with that, Daniel, do you have any final words, or Tessa?
No, just thank you so much, Mandy, and thank you so much, Tessa. What a pleasure.
Thank the two of you also. Yes, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I will add again that you can buy The Dark Side of Memory and many of Daniel's other books, including his newest one, on our website at pilsencommunitybooks.com or wherever books are sold. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Yes, thank you.